Around the year 1900, Europe was the most powerful continent in the world and had a profound influence on global politics. The countries of Europe had advanced far ahead of the rest of the world in science, industry, trade, and military power. Powers such as Britain, France, and Germany were rapidly establishing their dominance over different regions of the world. At that time, European countries possessed many large colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The British Empire was so vast that it was said that the sun never set on its empire. Important regions such as India, Canada, Australia, and Egypt were governed under the British Empire. France had also established its political and economic control over many regions in Africa and Asia. Germany was a relatively new nation, but its industrial and military progress was advancing very rapidly. All powerful nations were engaged in competition to gain control over more land, resources, and trade routes. Many weaker countries in Africa and Asia were being divided into spheres of influence by European powers. Germany was developing rapidly and had begun to challenge the old powers such as Britain and France. Germany's growing industrial capacity and economic strength had begun to change the balance of power in Europe. Britain feared that Germany would challenge its global leadership and commercial dominance in the future. Distrust and political tensions among the countries of Europe were steadily increasing. All countries were making heavy investments to strengthen their armies and develop modern weapons. Germany was expanding its army and navy, which caused concern among other nations. Britain began building new and more powerful warships to maintain its naval supremacy. France and Russia also began large-scale military recruitment to increase their military capabilities. Because of machine guns, heavy artillery, and modern warships, Europe was rapidly turning into an arsenal of weapons. By the year 1914, all of Europe appeared peaceful on the outside, but internally it was burning with the flames of war. Growing tensions among the countries of Europe forced them to form new military alliances for their security. Every country feared that a major war could break out in the future and that it might be left alone. This fear and distrust had begun to divide Europe into two major military blocs. The first bloc was the Triple Alliance, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These three countries promised that they would assist one another in the event of any external attack. Germany wanted to have allied nations that would stand by it in the event of war. Austria-Hungary wanted to maintain its influence in the Balkan region and felt threatened by Russia. Italy also decided to join the Triple Alliance in order to protect its interests. The second bloc was called the Triple Entente, which included Britain, France, and Russia. France was concerned about Germany's growing power and felt the need for strong allies. Russia considered itself the protector of the Slavic nations and wanted to expand its influence in the Balkan region. Britain initially did not want to be part of any permanent alliance, but it was concerned about Germany's power. Germany's rapidly growing navy forced Britain to take steps to secure its future. Gradually, Britain, France, and Russia began moving closer to one another, and their military cooperation increased. By now, all of Europe had been divided into two opposing blocs, and tensions continued to rise. An attack on one country meant that its allied nations could also become involved in the war. These secret military agreements increased the possibility that a small regional conflict could turn into a worldwide war. The leaders of Europe were talking about peace, but at the same time they were also preparing for a major war. The world had no idea that these alliances would soon change the fate of millions of people. Europe now needed only a single spark that would push the entire continent into a devastating war. The day of the 28th of June 1914 became a day in world history that changed the course of the entire world. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to Austria-Hungary, had set out on an official visit with his wife. At that time, the two were visiting the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia, where they were being given a grand welcome. No one had any idea that this visit would become one of the most important events in history within a few hours. Thousands of people were present on the streets of Sarajevo, and the royal couple was moving forward in an open vehicle. At that moment, a young nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, was hiding among the crowd and waiting for the right opportunity. Gavrilo Princip was associated with a Serbian nationalist organization and opposed the rule of Austria-Hungary. As soon as the royal vehicle reached him, he suddenly pulled out his pistol and fired shots. Those bullets seriously injured Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. A short time later, both of them died, and chaos spread throughout the city. This assassination took place in Sarajevo, but its effects soon began to be felt throughout Europe. Austria-Hungary began holding Serbia responsible for this incident. An atmosphere of fear, anger, and uncertainty began spreading rapidly among all the major countries of Europe. Because of military alliances, a local incident was gradually turning into an international crisis. No one knew that those shots fired in Sarajevo had begun the First World War. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary held Serbia responsible for the incident. Austria-Hungary presented Serbia with several harsh demands and requested an immediate response. Serbia accepted most of the conditions but refused to comply with some of the demands. This made Austria-Hungary even more furious, and it decided to take military action. On the 28th of July 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. At first, this this war appeared to be only a regional conflict between two countries. However, Europe's military alliances quickly turned this small conflict into a major crisis. The Russian Empire ordered its army to prepare for war in support of Serbia. Germany supported Austria-Hungary and reacted strongly to Russia's military activities. Germany then declared war on Russia and its ally, France. The German army planned to advance through Belgium in order to reach France. When Belgium's neutrality was violated, the United Kingdom also entered the war. One by one, many countries entered the conflict, and the situation began to spiral out of control. Within just a few days, all of Europe had been engulfed in the flames of war. For the first time, the world witnessed a war in which several powerful nations stood against one another simultaneously. As soon as the war began, Germany launched a rapid attack on France under its military plan. Germany's objective was to defeat France quickly and gain a decisive advantage in the war. The German army began advancing rapidly toward France through Belgium. This sudden attack forced France and its allies to take immediate counteraction. Fierce battles began between both sides, and thousands of soldiers were killed in the early days. As the fighting continued, the momentum of both armies gradually slowed down. For their protection, both sides began digging long and deep trenches in the ground. These trenches were called trenches and stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Soldiers stayed inside these trenches and tried to protect themselves from enemy bullets and artillery. The area between the trenches was called no man's land, where going was almost equivalent to suicide. Millions of soldiers had to live amid mud, rain, and severe cold. Many soldiers could not get enough food, clean water, or proper medical care. Because of rotting bodies, rats, and filth all around, life in the trenches became extremely horrifying. Continuous shelling went on day and night, keeping soldiers in constant fear and stress. Many soldiers suffered from severe psychological trauma in addition to physical injuries. Both sides launched repeated attacks, but they achieved very little success. Thousands of soldiers had to sacrifice their lives just to gain a few meters of land. The Western Front gradually turned into a battlefield where victory seemed almost impossible. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or permanently disabled on this front. Despite such terrible devastation, the front lines changed very little, and the conflict continued for years. The First World War introduced the world to new warfare technologies that completely changed the nature of combat. In this war, modern weapons were used on a large scale and in an organized manner for the first time. The machine gun emerged as one of the deadliest weapons and transformed the battlefield. A machine gun could fire hundreds of bullets within a few minutes and cause massive destruction. Thousands of soldiers advancing across open fields became victims of machine gun fire. During the war, tanks were also used on a large scale for the first time. Tanks were heavily armored vehicles that could cross trenches and barbed wire. Tanks provided protection to soldiers and helped break through enemy defensive lines. Fighter aircraft had also begun to play an important role in this war. At first, aircraft were used only for surveillance and gathering information. Later, machine guns and bombs were mounted on these aircraft, giving rise to aerial warfare. At sea, submarines emerged as a new and extremely dangerous weapon. German submarines hid beneath the sea and launched surprise attacks on enemy ships. Many merchant and military ships sank into the depths of the sea due to submarine attacks. One of the most terrifying technologies of this war was the use of poisonous gas. Poisonous gas severely damaged the eyes, lungs, and skin of soldiers. To protect themselves from gas attacks, soldiers were forced to wear special gas masks. New technologies made the war far faster, more destructive, and more terrifying than before. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or permanently disabled because of these modern weapons. The First World War proved that modern technology could also bring unprecedented destruction to human civilization. Although the war had begun in Europe, its effects reached the entire world within a short time. Because of military alliances and vast empires, this conflict could not remain limited to Europe alone. The colonies of Britain, France, and Germany were spread across different parts of the world. As the European powers entered the war, their colonies also became part of the conflict. New fronts of war also opened in the Middle East, and fierce battles began in many regions. With the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war, the entire Middle East became a center of conflict. In Africa, the colonies of European powers began fighting against one another, and many military campaigns were launched. Many regions of Asia were also deeply affected by this war, and their politics began to change. Millions of soldiers from many colonies, including India, were sent to fight on various fronts. Fierce conflicts had also begun between the navies of powerful nations at sea. Warships and submarines were continuously attacking one another to gain control of sea routes. Merchant ships also became targets of war, severely affecting global trade. This conflict was no longer a war between just a few countries. Many continents, sea regions, and colonies around the world had become engulfed in the flames of war. Millions of soldiers were forced to fight on unfamiliar lands thousands of kilometers away from their homes. The effects of the war began to appear in almost every sphere of politics, economy, and society. For the first time in human history, so many countries and regions had participated in a war simultaneously. This conflict had turned the entire world into one vast battlefield. Millions of people had been affected by this war either directly or indirectly. For this reason, this conflict came to be known in history as the First World War, or simply the World War. By the year 1917, the First World War had been going on for nearly 3 years, and both sides were suffering heavy losses. The war had become so long and destructive that neither side appeared to be achieving a clear victory. During this period, Germany made its submarine strategy at sea even more aggressive. German submarines were continuously attacking merchant and passenger ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Because of these attacks, many American ships also came under threat, and tensions rose rapidly. The United States wanted to remain out of the war for a long time and was avoiding direct intervention. However, the continuous attacks by German submarines alarmed the American people and leaders. The United States began to realize that its economic and national interests were now being directly affected. Finally, in April 1917, the United States officially decided to enter the war. The United States entered the war on the side of the Allies and began giving them its full support. The American army was relatively new at that time, but it possessed enormous resources and industrial capacity. The United States began sending large numbers of soldiers, weapons, and essential military supplies to Europe. American factories continuously produced weapons, ammunition, and other supplies for the Allied powers. The arrival of millions of new soldiers rapidly boosted the morale of the Allied powers. On the other hand, Germany and its allies were suffering from exhaustion, shortages of resources, and heavy losses. The fresh energy and resources brought by American soldiers gradually began to change the course of the war. For the first time, the Allied powers began to believe that they could win this long and difficult war. The situation for Germany was becoming more difficult and challenging day by day. The First World War was now moving toward its final and most decisive phase. America's entry into the war changed the course of events and laid the foundation for the defeat of the Central Powers. By the year 1918, the First World War had reached its final stage, and the Central Powers had begun to weaken. The 4-year-long war had severely damaged Germany's economy. Production in factories was declining, and a severe shortage of essential resources had developed. Because of the blockade of Germany, the supply of food and raw materials was continuously being disrupted. The food crisis in the country's cities and villages was rapidly worsening. Millions of people were struggling with serious problems such as hunger, inflation, and poverty. The long years of war had completely exhausted German soldiers physically and mentally. Continuous fighting and heavy losses on the fronts had shattered the morale of the soldiers. With the arrival of new American forces, the position of the Allied powers was becoming increasingly stronger. On the other hand, the Central Powers no longer had sufficient soldiers and resources left. Bulgaria was the first to admit defeat and decide to withdraw from the war. After that, the Ottoman Empire also became unable to continue the war because of continuous defeats. Some time later, the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire also began to collapse and disintegrate. Germany was now almost isolated, and no clear solution remained before it. Protests and rebellions had begun in many parts of the country. The people wanted peace and were demanding an immediate end to the war. The pressure on the German government to end the war was increasing day by day. One by one, the Central Powers were being defeated, and their military strength was fading away. By the end of 1918, it had become clear that the Central Powers could no longer win the war. The end of the First World War was now only a few days away. By November 1918, Germany's military, economic, and political situation had become completely weakened. The German army was continuously retreating and no longer had the capacity to continue the war. Across the country, demands for peace and an end to the war were growing rapidly. The people had become extremely distressed by hunger, poverty, and the continuous loss of lives. Rebellions began in many cities, and immense pressure started building on the government. Amid this crisis, the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicated his position. The new German government decided to begin negotiations with the Allied powers for an armistice. Finally, on the 11th of November 1918, the armistice agreement was signed. At exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, shelling and fighting ceased across the entire Western Front. The devastating battle that had continued for 4 years finally came to an end. Millions of soldiers were hearing the news of the war's end with the hope of returning home. Many cities and villages across Europe had been completely devastated. Millions of people had lost their loved ones, and millions of soldiers had been wounded or permanently disabled. This war brought an end to many empires and changed the political map of the world. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires disintegrated after this war. The First World War proved to be one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. This war made the world realize the new need for peace, security, and international cooperation. However, even after the war ended, many problems and grievances remained unresolved. These unresolved issues gave rise to new tensions and conflicts in the years that followed. The world did not yet know that from the ashes of the First World War, another terrible world war was about to be born.